It was an ordinary May afternoon on the 7th, 2017, in the small town of Betrayal, Ohio. The sun was shining softly through the trees, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood made it feel like just another peaceful day. But for David Kenny, his wife Sherry, and their young daughter, this day would prove to be anything but ordinary. David had been friends with Brad McGarry for years. Their bond went beyond just being co-workers. They had shared laughter, tears, and the ups and downs of life. The two men had met while training to become coal miners, a difficult and dangerous job that they both decided to take on to secure their futures. It had been during this time that David had introduced Brad to his family, and before long, Brad had become a beloved part of their household. The kids called him Uncle Brad, and they spent holidays together, enjoying each other's company as though they were family. The Kenny family and Brad shared a bond that many could only dream of. But on that particular afternoon, something felt off. The Kenny family had arrived at Brad's house to return a weed trimmer. They had no idea that this seemingly simple task would lead them to discover a crime scene that would change their lives forever. As they walked up to Brad's house, they noticed something strange. His car was parked in the driveway, but there was no answer when they knocked on the door. David's sense of unease grew, and he led his family to the back of the house. The back door was slightly ajar, an unusual sight for a man like Brad, who was known for his organized nature. Sherry called out Brad's name, but there was no response. The silence in the air only heightened their growing concern. David, trusting his instincts, stepped into the house, with Sherry following closely behind. What they found inside would leave them horrified. The house was in disarray. Signs that something had gone terribly wrong were all around them. David's heart raced as he looked around. There were drawers left open, furniture overturned, and a sense of chaos that made it clear this was no ordinary situation. Sherry began to search upstairs while David made his way toward the basement. He had a sinking feeling that whatever had happened, it was down there. As David descended into the basement, his eyes locked onto a chilling sight: Brad's body lying in a pool of blood. The horror was overwhelming. Brad, the man who had been a trusted friend, mentor, and uncle to his children, was gone. David's scream echoed through the house, and Sherry rushed to his side. "Call 911!" David choked out, his voice breaking. Sherry immediately dialed the authorities, her hands trembling as she described the grisly discovery. The police arrived quickly, their faces serious as they assessed the situation. The Kenny family, still in shock, explained how they had arrived at Brad's house to return a weed trimmer and found the back door open, only to stumble upon the crime scene. They spoke of their close relationship with Brad, recounting the years of shared memories and love that had tied them together as family. When questioned about any potential enemies or recent troubles in Brad's life, David and Sherry mentioned a man named Scotty, a man Brad had recently ended a tumultuous relationship with. Although they didn't know his last name, they described the relationship as fraught with constant arguments and tension. Brad had been trying to move on, but the emotional strain had been evident to those close to him. The police carefully examined the scene, looking for any evidence that could point them to a possible suspect. Brad's body lay face down in the pool of blood, and the forensic expert quickly confirmed that he had been shot at least once in the head. However, there was no weapon at the scene. This raised immediate questions about the nature of the death. At first, the officers wondered if Brad might have taken his own life. It seemed plausible, given the state of the house and the fact that Brad had been dealing with a difficult breakup. But when the forensic team turned the body over, the absence of a weapon quickly dispelled that theory. As the officers continued to investigate, they began to notice strange details that made them reconsider the possibility of a robbery gone wrong. The kitchen was in disarray, with drawers left open, and the living room was a mess. However, valuable items, including a television and some artwork Brad had collected, remained untouched. The scene didn't match the typical pattern of a robbery. It became clear that something more complex was at play. The police began to wonder if the crime had been staged to throw them off the scent of the real motive. Given Brad's open homosexuality and his work in a traditionally conservative environment, The detectives considered the possibility of a hate crime, but when they spoke with Brad's colleagues at the coal mine, they were surprised to hear that he had been well liked by his peers. No one had a bad word to say about him. They respected him, and the idea of Brad being targeted because of his sexuality didn't seem to fit. It was then that the detectives turned to another lead, Brad's relationship with Scotty. The couple had recently split, and it was clear from the statements of Brad's friend, Wendy, that things had taken a darker turn in their relationship. Wendy had voiced her concern over the relationship, noting how Brad had become more involved with Scotty, despite the constant drama and emotional toll it took on him. As the police dug deeper, they discovered Scotty's full name and attempted to track him down for questioning. When they arrived at his home, Scotty's mother informed them that he had been in jail for violating his probation for the past 3 months. This immediately ruled Scotty out as the suspect, but the investigators remained cautious. They wondered if Scotty had orchestrated the crime from behind bars, possibly enlisting the help of an accomplice. 2 days later, a major breakthrough occurred. A cousin of Brad's came forward with new information that would shift the investigation in an unexpected direction. The cousin revealed that Brad had mentioned to her, shortly before leaving a family gathering that day, that a man named DJ was supposed to visit his house. Brad even joked about taking a nap with him, hinting at a romantic connection. At first, the cousin didn't know who DJ was, but after some persistent questioning, she revealed a shocking twist. DJ was David Kenny, the man who had discovered Brad's lifeless body. The detective's jaw dropped. David, who had appeared to be a grieving friend, was suddenly the prime suspect. David Kenny's world seemed to stop in that moment. The words coming from the detective's mouth seemed to echo endlessly in his ears. DJ, David Kenny, was now at the center of a murder investigation involving the death of his closest friend. His mind raced, struggling to understand how things had spiraled so out of control. For a brief second, David wondered if he was hearing things wrong, but the detective's words were clear. His own name had come up in connection with Brad's death. "We need you to come down to the station with us," the lead detective said, his face impassive, but the weight of the situation pressing down on David with full force. David's heart pounded in his chest. He felt a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck, and his legs felt weak. He had been Brad's best friend for years. How could they possibly be considering him a suspect? He had found Brad's body. He was the one who had called 911, the one who had been utterly devastated by the loss. But the detective's growing suspicion made it clear that they didn't see it that way. As they led David to the police car, the realization hit him with full force. Something wasn't adding up. Had they truly believed that he could have been involved in Brad's death? Or was this some kind of terrible misunderstanding? The trip to the station felt like an eternity. Inside the interrogation room, David sat down at a cold metal table, his hands shaking as he tried to piece together what had gone wrong. His mind was filled with conflicting emotions. He was grieving the loss of his best friend, the man he had called a brother, but now he was being questioned like a criminal. He had no idea how to explain the situation, and his thoughts were a blur. The detective sat across from him, his expression unyielding. "Tell us about your relationship with Brad," he began. "We know you were close. Too close, perhaps." David was stunned by the question. What did that even mean? Brad was his friend, his family. How could that possibly be wrong? He swallowed hard and leaned forward. "Brad was my best friend. He was like a brother to me. We've known each other for years. He and I worked together, trained together. We went through everything together. We shared a bond. A deep bond." The detective raised an eyebrow. "Is it true that you were close with Brad outside of work, too? That you spent time with him when you weren't working? And that your wife and children also considered him family?" David nodded, confused by the line of questioning. "Yes, absolutely. Brad was at our house all the time. We celebrated holidays together. My kids called him Uncle Brad. He was a part of our family." The detective's gaze never wavered. "And you never saw anything strange in his relationship with Scotty?" David's stomach dropped. He had expected the police to ask about Brad's complicated relationship with Scotty, but it still felt like a punch in the gut. He knew that Brad had recently gone through a difficult breakup with Scotty, But that had been weeks ago. Brad had seemed to be moving on, focusing on other things, like work and his family. They had never suspected that Brad's past relationship might have led to violence. "I don't know," David said, his voice shaking. Brad never really talked about Scotty much. He was done with him, as far as I knew. The breakup was ugly, but Brad had started talking to other people. He was trying to move on. The detective didn't seem convinced. "So you were unaware that Brad had mentioned someone named DJ coming to visit him on the day he died?" David's blood ran cold. He tried to grasp at the memory, but nothing about it made sense. "DJ? I don't know any DJ." The detective stared at him intently. Brad mentioned that he was expecting someone named DJ, a man he was supposed to meet on the day he was killed, and by all accounts, DJ was supposed to come to his house that afternoon. But when we checked the security footage, we found that you were there too, before you called 911. David felt a cold, crushing weight settle in his chest. The detective's words seemed to pierce his thoughts like a blade. Could this be happening? Had Brad somehow connected him to the name DJ, the same name that was now being used against him? He had no idea what the detective was talking about. DJ was just a nickname that was linked to him, David. "You must be mistaken," David stammered. "I didn't have anything to do with Brad's death. I loved that man. He was family to me. I found him dead in his basement. I called for help. I would never hurt him." The detective remained unmoved. "We'll see about that, Mr. Kenny. We're just trying to piece together the truth here. We know you were close, but we need you to tell us everything, starting with your whereabouts on the day of Brad's death." David's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. It was all too much, too fast, too confusing. He had spent years building a life with his family and had worked hard to gain the respect of his colleagues and friends. But now, everything was being called into question. He remembered that he had spent the morning running errands and taking care of his children. It was all a blur, but he knew he had returned home around noon to grab a few things before heading to Brad's place. He had gone there to return the weed trimmer, nothing more. Brad had been his friend, his family. Why would anyone think that he could be responsible for Brad's death? "I went there to drop off the trimmer," David said, his voice growing firmer. "That's all. I didn't even know Brad was dead until I went inside and saw him. Why would I do that to him? He was my friend." The detective's face softened for a brief moment, but it quickly returned to its serious demeanor. "We have to follow every lead, Mr. Kenny. Just give us a moment. We'll see where the evidence leads." David was left alone in the cold room, his mind swirling. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and desperation. He had never felt so powerless in his life. His best friend, his family, was dead, and now he was the prime suspect. Hours passed in that sterile, cold interrogation room. David had been left alone so long that his mind had started to fray at the edges. He had replayed the events of the day over and over in his head, desperately trying to find something, anything, that could clear his name. But the more he thought about it, the more questions he had. Brad had been his friend. They had been through so much together, loss, triumph, and everything in between. How could anyone believe he had anything to do with Brad's death? And yet, the detective's questions had planted seeds of doubt in David's mind. What if he had missed something? What if Brad had been hiding something from him? The door creaked open, breaking his thoughts. The lead detective walked in, his expression unreadable. Behind him, another officer wheeled in a cart with a small stack of files. "We've had some time to go over the evidence," the detective began, sitting across from David. He placed the files on the table with a deliberate motion. "And we think it's time we got to the bottom of this." David's pulse quickened. He knew the words were coming, but they still hit him like a ton of bricks. "We found something, David," the detective continued. "Something that makes us think you're not being entirely truthful." David's stomach twisted into knots. He tried to steady his breath, but it was difficult. He had no idea what they were about to reveal, but he had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't be in his favor. "We checked Brad's phone," the detective said, his voice low. He had been in contact with someone in the days leading up to his death, a number you were calling frequently. Can you explain that? David's eyes widened. He couldn't remember being in touch with Brad that often in the days leading up to his death. He had seen him at work, sure, and they had chatted a few times about a new project, but nothing out of the ordinary. He had assumed that Brad had been getting his life back on track after his breakup with Scotty. Nothing strange. I don't understand, David muttered. Brad and I, we were friends. Of course, we talked. The detective cut him off. We also found that you were at Brad's house the morning he died. Before anyone else arrived, his neighbors reported seeing your car in the driveway. Your phone records also show you were there around 10:30 a.m. David froze. The detective's words hit him like an explosion. He had arrived at Brad's house that morning to drop off a weed trimmer. That much was true. But the fact that his phone records had been tracked and that they had pinpointed his exact time of arrival made it clear that the police were piecing together every single detail. I didn't go inside, David stammered. I didn't go in until later. After I dropped the trimmer off, I went back to the car. I swear, I was just dropping it off, and then I left. The detective remained calm, but firm. That's not what your records show, Mr. Kenny. According to the timeline, you were in the house much longer than you're admitting. For nearly 45 minutes, in fact. David's throat went dry. He tried to recall what happened in that time. He had dropped off the trimmer and then... What? He couldn't remember. The pressure of the situation was clouding his thoughts, making everything seem fragmented. Look, I don't know what to say, David said, his voice cracking. I found Brad, and I called 911. That's all I know. I swear I didn't... You found him? The detective raised an eyebrow. And what was he doing in the basement, David? That's the real question. What was Brad doing down there? David's heart skipped a beat. The detective's words suddenly hit him like a jolt of electricity. He had found Brad's body in the basement, yes, but there had been no sign of struggle. No blood, no signs of forced entry. It made no sense that Brad, of all people, would have been down there without reason. I don't know, David admitted. Brad's basement was unfinished. He didn't use it much. It was just a storage area, really. The detective leaned in, his voice low but deadly serious. David, there's something you're not telling us. You were too close to Brad, too close to his life. You were too involved. David's hands trembled, and his heart pounded in his chest. The walls seemed to close in around him. He was drowning in this web of suspicion, with no way out. His mind whirled, desperate to make sense of everything, but all he could come up with were fragments of memory that made no sense. Listen to me, David said, his voice rising. Brad was my best friend. He was like a brother to me. I loved him. I didn't kill him. You have to believe me. But the detective didn't look convinced. He was already shuffling through the papers on the table as if David's pleas were nothing more than background noise. The officer who had brought the files in was now standing next to him, and the two exchanged a glance before the detective turned back to David. We also found something else, the detective said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Brad's will. David froze. A will? Why would Brad have made a will? He was only in his mid-30s. Why would he think to do something like that? Brad's will named you as the sole beneficiary of his estate, the detective continued. Everything. His house, his savings, his car, everything. David couldn't breathe. His throat tightened, and his mind felt as if it were being consumed by darkness. He hadn't known about any will. He had no idea that Brad had made such arrangements. Could this be part of the reason the police were suspicious of him? Could they believe that money was his motive? I didn't know about the will, David stammered. I swear to you. Brad never said anything about it. We talked about everything, but never about his finances. The detective stood up, gathering the papers. We'll be in touch, David. You're free to go for now, but understand this. We're watching you, and we'll be back if we need more answers. David was left alone once more. His mind was in turmoil, and his body felt like it was on the edge of collapse. Every new revelation felt like another piece of a puzzle that didn't make any sense. But one thing was clear. If he didn't figure out what was happening, he would lose everything. His family, his reputation, his life. And worse, he might lose his freedom. David had barely made it back to his apartment before his phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, but instinctively, David answered. "David?" The voice on the other end was urgent, and it was unmistakably Brad's ex-girlfriend, Megan. "Megan? Is everything okay?" David asked, trying to hide the panic that had started bubbling in his chest. His conversation with the detective had left him unsettled, and now hearing Megan's voice only seemed to add to the chaos in his mind. "I need to talk to you. It's about Brad," Megan said, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong, David. I don't think you're the only one who's been investigated." David's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about? What do you know?" There was a long pause, and when Megan spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. Brad's death wasn't just a random accident. Something more. I think someone close to him was involved. David's blood ran cold. He couldn't process her words. If it wasn't an accident, then what could it have been? And why was she telling him this now? "Megan, what are you saying? You think I had something to do with it?" David's voice came out harsh, despite the panic he was feeling. No, of course not," she quickly replied, her voice becoming frantic. "But I've been doing some digging, and I found something that doesn't make sense. I think Brad was getting involved in something dangerous before he died. And I think someone might have been trying to protect themselves." David's head spun. The detective had just suggested that he might be involved, and now Megan was hinting that Brad's death was connected to something far darker than he could ever imagine. "I don't know what you're talking about. I need you to tell me everything, Megan." "Now," David urged, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I'm meeting someone tomorrow morning," she said, almost whispering. "I think they know more than they're letting on. They were one of the last people to see Brad, but there's something off about them. I don't trust them, and I don't trust the police, either." David's chest tightened. "Who is it? Who are you meeting?" "I can't say over the phone, David, but I need you to meet me at Brad's place first thing tomorrow. I'll explain everything then. I don't know who else I can trust right now." Before David could respond, Megan ended the call abruptly. His mind raced. Brad's death had become an enigma wrapped in layers of suspicion, and now it seemed like there were even more questions than answers. What had Brad gotten himself mixed up in? And how did it all tie back to him? Megan's cryptic words only added to the firestorm of confusion and anxiety that was threatening to consume him. David lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The interrogation earlier had left him rattled, but Megan's call had shattered any remaining semblance of peace. What if she was right? What if Brad had known something dangerous and had been trying to protect himself? And more importantly, what if that danger had now turned on David? His thoughts circled like vultures, preying on his mind. He had to go to Brad's house tomorrow. He had to find out the truth, no matter what it took. David arrived at Brad's house just as the sun was rising. The house was eerily quiet, just as it had been the day he found Brad's body. The memories of that moment flooded his mind. Finding Brad lying motionless in the basement, the coldness of his skin, the horror of realizing his best friend was gone. He forced himself to push the memories aside as he walked up to the front door. Megan was waiting for him inside, pacing back and forth anxiously. When she saw David, she rushed over. "David, thank God you're here," she said in a low voice. I don't know who to trust anymore. There's something wrong with all of this." David could feel the intensity of her emotions, but he needed answers. "Megan, tell me what's going on. What are you trying to say?" She led him into the living room, where she pulled out a set of files from her bag. "These are documents I found in Brad's office," she said, her hands trembling as she flipped through the papers. "I've been digging into Brad's finances, his business dealings, and I found some things that don't add up." David felt his stomach churn. What could she have found? Was it something that had been hidden from him all this time? "These papers," she continued, are related to Brad's involvement with some people who aren't exactly above board. He was working with a company, an investment firm actually, that's been under investigation for money laundering. David's eyes widened. Money laundering? What are you talking about? Brad was never involved in anything like that. I know, Megan said, shaking her head. I didn't believe it at first either. But the deeper I dug, the more I found. Brad had been working with them for a while. He kept it hidden, even from me. I think he was trying to distance himself from them, but I think he knew too much, and someone wanted to silence him. David's mind was racing. Brad had always been the guy who hated dealing with anything shady. He would never have involved himself in something so criminal, but the evidence was there, in Megan's hands, and David didn't know what to make of it. Do you think Brad knew about the investigation? David asked. I think he might have, Megan replied softly. And I think that's why he was so nervous in the days before he died. He was scared. He was being watched, David, and I think whoever did this wanted to keep him quiet. The weight of her words hung in the air like a suffocating fog. David had been so focused on the idea that he might be the prime suspect that he hadn't considered any of this. The possibility that Brad's death had been part of something much larger, something dangerous, was something he hadn't been prepared for. Megan, I need to know what to do next. If there's someone out there who would kill to keep Brad quiet, then I need to figure out who they are. Megan nodded grimly. I have a meeting with someone who might know more about this. I don't trust them fully, but they were involved with Brad. They might be able to point us in the right direction. You need to be careful, David. There are people out there who will stop at nothing. David's thoughts swirled as he thought about the next steps. This was no longer just about clearing his name. It was about finding out who had killed his best friend and why. And it seemed like the deeper he went, the darker the secrets became. David's mind was clouded with 1,000 questions, each one more urgent than the last. The pieces of the puzzle had begun to fall into place, but the picture that was emerging was one he hadn't anticipated, one that left him with more fear than answers. His best friend, Brad, had gotten mixed up in something far darker than a simple accident. And now, that darkness seemed to be closing in on him as well. As he stood in Brad's house, the file in Megan's hand seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. She had pulled him into something that he was unprepared for, something that had already cost Brad his life and could very well cost David his. So, what now? David asked, his voice barely a whisper. Megan stood still, her fingers trembling as she held the file. We need to get to the bottom of this. The police aren't going to help us. I've already told you everything I know, but there's one person I think we need to speak to. A person Brad was close to. They might know something that could change everything. Who is it? David's voice was tight with both fear and determination. I can't say over the phone. It's too dangerous, Megan replied, looking out the window nervously. But they might be the key to this whole mess. They know more about the people Brad was involved with. People who have connections you don't even want to imagine. David nodded. Where are we meeting them? Megan hesitated. There's a diner on the outskirts of town. We'll meet there. It's neutral ground, and it'll be safe. David couldn't shake the feeling that everything was leading up to this moment, an inevitable confrontation that would reveal the truth, but also put him in even greater danger. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay ahead, but there was no turning back now. The truth about Brad's death had to come out, for his friend, for the closure, and for his own peace of mind. The diner was old, tucked away in a corner of the city that few people visited. It had a worn-down charm with chipped wooden booths and flickering neon lights that barely illuminated the night. It wasn't the kind of place where people would expect to meet someone with the kind of information David needed, but it would have to do. David and Megan sat in a corner booth, their eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. The minutes dragged on, and the silence between them grew heavier, thick with the tension of what was to come. Then, the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, a tall man, dressed in a long coat, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. He scanned the diner, his eyes landing on David and Megan. For a split second, time seemed to stop. The man's presence radiated something cold and unsettling. He approached the table without saying a word, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. Megan was visibly nervous, her hand clenched around the file she'd brought with her. David's heart raced. "This is it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man, who introduced himself as Nathan, wasted no time getting to the point. "I'm not here to waste anyone's time," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Brad's death wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, and it's connected to something much bigger than you realize." David swallowed hard. "What do you mean? What's going on, Nathan? Brad was my best friend. He wouldn't get involved with anything dangerous." Nathan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Brad was involved with a criminal organization. He got too deep, too quickly. He was laundering money for them, acting as a middleman between them and some of the wealthiest clients in the country. David's head spun. This couldn't be true. He had known Brad his whole life. He had been a good person, kind, loyal, and always staying clear of anything shady. But here was Nathan, someone who seemed to know too much, dropping bombshell after bombshell. "I don't believe you," David said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Brad was never like that." Nathan's expression hardened. "I don't care if you believe me or not. The truth doesn't change just because you don't want it to. Brad had a job to do, but he was getting cold feet. He wanted out, and the people he worked for don't like it when people try to leave." "Who are these people?" Megan asked, her voice trembling. Nathan hesitated, then sighed. "They go by several names, but the most well-known is the Syndicate. They're a shadow group that operates above the law, pulling the strings in finance, politics, and organized crime. They were laundering billions, using Brad as a middleman for their transactions, and when he tried to get out, they decided he was a liability." David's blood ran cold. "So they killed him?" he asked, barely able to breathe. Nathan nodded. "It wasn't just a random act of violence. It was calculated. Brad had too much information, and they couldn't risk him talking. They sent a message. And now, they know you're asking questions." David's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together. Brad hadn't died by accident. He'd been murdered for trying to do the right thing, trying to break free from a dangerous web of criminals who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. "And what does this have to do with me?" David asked, his voice raw. Nathan looked at him intently. "You're a threat, David. You've been poking around in things you don't understand. The Syndicate won't hesitate to come after you next if they think you know too much." Megan's face turned pale. "So, what do we do now?" Nathan's eyes flickered with a mix of sympathy and cold determination. "We expose them. We take down the Syndicate. It won't be easy and it won't be safe. But if we don't act now, Brad's death will be in vain." David's stomach churned. He had never imagined that his search for answers would lead him to this, taking on a powerful criminal organization. But there was no turning back. Brad deserved justice, and David wasn't going to stop until he got it. In the days that followed, David and Megan worked with Nathan to gather evidence against the Syndicate. It was a dangerous game, one that required them to be constantly on guard. They dug deeper into Brad's financial records, spoke to sources who had been close to him, and even faced off against some of the Syndicate's hired enforcers, but it was all worth it when they finally exposed the truth. The Syndicate's operations were shut down, and several key players were arrested. Brad's name was cleared, and his death no longer remained a mystery. However, the cost of this victory was high. David knew that he would never be the same person again. The weight of Brad's death, the dangers they had faced, and the things they had uncovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. But in the end, he had fulfilled his promise to his best friend. Brad had been avenged, and justice had been served.